Thank you for watching. Before I open it up for questions, I just want to talk a little bit about what I'm doing with the film now. After making it as a class project and showing it to a few different audiences, I really kind of found that there was this need out there to kind of speak out as a third generation and to kind of promote that viewpoint of what it means to be a third generation survivor. And so since then, I've really had two goals for the film. The first goal is to really use it in educational settings like this to kind of show to students the importance of not only speaking out about kind of the Holocaust, but holding on to the lessons that come out of that in terms of preventing small acts of discrimination, and for example, how the Nazis really started by burning books in the town square and how little acts really built up to this tremendous atrocity. And so I'm working with the Anti-Defamation League, as Mrs. Connect mentioned. They have a program called Bearing Witness that brings educators together and really gives them the resources and curricula to teach the Holocaust in their classrooms. So they're now using the film as part of their national outreach campaign. I also was working with an organization called Facing History and Ourselves, which works with public and private schools and helping them kind of communicate lessons of the past and applying them to today. And so they're also using the film, and they've partnered with an organization that I'm a part of called 3GNY, which is Grandchildren of Survivors in the New York area, to help launch a teaching initiative to get grandchildren of survivors to teach in schools. And so I try to take off time sometimes from my day job and go into schools in Harlem and around the New York City area to really show the film. But the second goal for the film is really to get other grandchildren of survivors involved in creating multimedia projects, because really the time is limited for them to really capture some of the footage from their grandparents who are still alive. And so I'm working with Steven Spielberg's Shoah Foundation out at USC to really make that happen. And as they begin to digitize their archive, I'm helping them launch a 3G platform to get grandchildren who either their grandparents have given testimony into the archive or who have not yet given testimony to kind of come together and create this network that hopefully will be self-sustaining, and that other grandchildren will be able to help the future ones who want to make films. So I'm happy to answer any questions, but before I open it up, I just would like to tell a story. I was in a school in Harlem a few months ago, and a 6th grade boy raised his hand at the back of the room and asked, after watching this film, whether I blamed the bystanders or the perpetrators. It was a really powerful question, and I'm sure I'll hear some of those questions from you today, but it was a really hard question for me to answer, and really the only way that I could address that question was to tell a story that my grandfather shared with me when we were in Auschwitz. We were sitting in Auschwitz, and my family actually was going down into the gas chambers to see what it looked like down there, and I made the decision that that was not something that I actually could do, and I sat outside the gas chambers with my grandfather, and we sat there talking, and he started telling me this story about how when he was in the camp, he actually was assigned to be the gardener. When he first arrived, there was a Nazi soldier who asked if anyone knew how to plant flowers, and he raised his hand and said, "I do." And so in return, he got an extra piece of bread each day. So he kept gardening, I guess, for a few months. And then one day, a few Jewish inmates walked by and trampled over the flowers that he had been planting, and the Nazi soldier saw this happening and went to my grandfather and said, "Did you see what they did to the flowers? Go beat them." And so he gave my grandfather a stick to go beat his fellow Jews, and my grandfather refused. And so in turn, my grandfather was beaten and lost his job as the gardener and no longer had the extra loaf of bread. And so when people ask the perpetrators versus bystanders, my only response is to share that story in terms of what my grandfather did and what he was willing to stand up. He was essentially willing to risk his own life. He very well could have died at that time, but he was willing to stand up and to succumb to kind of the abuse of the Nazi guard in order to not kind of essentially do the same thing to the other prisoners that they were doing. So with that story, I just would like to open it up to questions. Feel free to ask me anything about my grandparents, about me, about kind of making the film. And then, of course, if you would rather ask me a question in private, I'll be around for a little bit afterwards. So, questions? Sure, great question. The question is about the people who hid my grandmother. So, as you saw in the film, they were in a little village called Poropka, right out in Slovakia, and it was a Catholic family in Slovakia who hid my grandmother, and her family. My grandmother's family had a little bit of money in Slovakia, and so they were able to relocate into the village, and she actually had a lot of uncles who ended up going into the mountains right outside the village they were staying in and being part of the resistance. But really, when my grandmother was in hiding, it wasn't, I'm sure some of you have read the Diary of Anne Frank. She wasn't in a basement, kind of not able to move. In some ways, when the Nazis came through, she did have to kind of hide, but she basically was adopted into this family. She went to church with the family, and she had cousins living with other families in the village, and she knew the cousins, obviously, but they had to pretend they didn't know each other in the town, because that would have given it away. But when we went back on this trip, and this isn't in the film, my brother, who was filming, asked the sister of the woman who had hid my grandmother why did you hide them? What was kind of the impetus for that? And the woman looked at him and in Slovak said, because it was the right thing to do. So I think, as Mrs. Knecht brought up in the beginning, that there's a lot of horror that comes out of the Holocaust, but there also is a lot of hope. There were the people who kind of sacrificed their own lives and went out of their way to save the Jews for no reason, but just because it was the right thing to do. Mrs. Knecht. So that's a good question. From the start of when he actually was deported from his town in Poland to the end of the war, I believe it was 3 years, and he was in Auschwitz for a little bit more than a year and a half. And after Auschwitz was sent on a death march, and right before liberation, ended up actually finding his brother, and so the two of them on this death march essentially carried themselves, and the only reason they say each of them survived was because they found each other. And on that death march, it was in the middle of the winter, and the only reason they survived was because of the snow, and they were able to have at least some water. There was no food, and then the Allies came at the very end of that march through. Yeah, up there. So I can't hear. Well, so that's a really tough question, but the goal of kind of the Nazis and the Holocaust is, there's so many reasons this all started in terms of kind of Hitler's rise to power, and really the goal was to knock out the Jewish race. It was called the Final Solution, and they were really trying to get rid of anyone that wasn't of the Aryan race in Germany and across Europe. And so it started out small. Jews weren't allowed to go into certain shops or own stores, or they weren't allowed to go out past a certain hour at night. And then it continued to escalate to the point where they were sending them and deporting them to camps and sending them to gas chambers and killing them. And so the real goal was to one day to get rid of the race, and luckily through acts of resistance and obviously the international community getting together and recognizing the horrific aspect of this, that goal did not succumb, and I'm obviously here to talk about it. But that was the goal, and I think recognizing that some people in the world still have the goal, whether it be to kill a certain tribe or a certain type of people all around the world, that there are still those people who exist, and it's important for kind of the world and the community to recognize when that's happening and stop it from happening earlier on than in this example where 6 million people were lost before the war ended. time for one. Sure. How has my opinion on the Holocaust changed? I think really I always grew up knowing that it was an important event in my own life, and through this film kind of getting even more familiar with it and more familiar with my grandparents' story kind of every step of the way, recognizing that everything I was learning I wanted to share with the rest of the world, because if everyone had kind of this experience of hearing firsthand from their grandfather what it was like to be in the barracks of Auschwitz, there's no way that they would let other acts of genocide go on around the world. And so I don't know if my perception of the Holocaust per se has changed, but really my energy and willingness to get out there and share this message to as many people as possible, I would say, is kind of what has really taken shape since making the film. Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Sarah will be around to ask questions after if you're free, and Mr. Esquire has an announcement.
I would ask that the participants in the art contest and Mr. Morris and Mrs. Knecht, if you'd remain in chapel, please, as well as Sarah. I've seen the film before, so it gave me an opportunity to actually watch you during the film. And it's such an important work that you're doing. And I think all of us need to know how hard it is for her to do this. And watching and re-experiencing what you did. So thank you so much. Let's thank her again. You're dismissed.